Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in another Prime Minister's questions, this time one where Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, was seemingly tired of being asked questions at Prime Minister's questions, tried to ask a load of Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, who responded that if you want to swap roles, I'm more than happy to do that right now. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, kicking off, there are a couple of major things that you knew were going to be asked by not only the leaders of the opposition parties, but also other MPs as well. One, of course, was about all the commissions that keep being authorised by the government into racial equality, but no actual action taking place. And the other one, of course, is the victory for common sense, quite frankly, on extending free school meals across summer in England. And kicking off, there was an SNP MP, whose name I don't know, I'm sorry, was asking about the head of the new commission. So the government keep having reports and keep having recommendations produced, but they don't really like those recommendations. So they issue another commission to show that they're really serious about racial equality. We're going to have another commission, but you've already had a load. Can you not just do what those reports tell you? No, we need another one. And that was pretty much what happened here. The MP was basically, saying the head of the new commission as well is someone who has views that are not really consistent with trying to improve racial equality, shall we say. And he asked about that. But the Prime Minister did, bizarrely, I thought, acknowledge the fact that, yes, there's a lot of commissions taking place. I'm conscious of the fact a lot of people are saying, well, there are all these other commissions that have taken place. But he says, but that's why there needs to be another commission. You work that one out. I can't. Anyway, on to the opposition leaders. So Keir Starmer first and then Ian Blackford. Keir Starmer, as leader of the opposition, gets 6 questions. And in his first one, he welcomed a couple of things, particularly he actually said, I welcome the Prime Minister's latest U-turn, this time on free school meals. And then he decided to go with the child poverty angle on this. And he quoted a government report saying that there are an extra 600,000 more children in poverty as compared to 2012, which was also when the Conservative government were in power. And he described a projection of the number of children in poverty to reach 5.2 million by 2022. And he asked what the Prime Minister thinks caused that. And so then Boris Johnson stood up and he said when it comes to free school meals, this government is very proud. It says, they set up the free school meals, which I imagine means not the current Conservative government. They certainly didn't. They've been around a long time. I imagine he's referring to the previous Conservative government, possibly Margaret Thatcher or John Majors, to which, of course, you could always say that free school meals in themselves are symptomatic of a situation where you have people in poverty in the first place. But anyway, but when he says this government, it's a bit misleading that, because it's not actually this government. It may be a former government of the same party. But anyway, the point is, he says that absolute and relative poverty have both declined. Now, this is in contradiction to the quotes that Keir Starmer made of a government report, not an independent report, the government's own report. Because remember, what I've said is that Keir Starmer's quite effective at this. He quotes, generally speaking, he actually quotes the government. He'll quote ministers or he'll quote government reports. So basically, Boris Johnson didn't answer that question because he tried to deny it. So then Keir Starmer said, that the Prime Minister's saying that poverty has not increased, but I'm quoting from a government report published last week. That's his government. And he noted that the Prime Minister didn't reply to the figure quoted. And he even got a laugh. And he said, I'm sure the Prime Minister has read this report, which got a big old laugh. Because obviously we know he doesn't. He admits it as much himself. But then he asked, so what is the Prime Minister going to do to prevent further childhood poverty? Now, at this point, the Prime Minister, again, he didn't answer the question. But I did think that the way he's approaching this is going to work for him to an extent. And I do think that Starmer needs to scotch this one. So what he said was, oh, Starmer's talking about projected poverty. No, that's not. I'm talking about what's actually happened, and poverty has gone down. He's talking about some projection, because then you get in the minds of some observers, oh, right, yeah, because a projection may not be true. There may be errors in it. It may be pure speculation. And he says that what has actually happened, is that poverty has gone down. But that's not true, because Starmer quoted an actual increase, the government's own figures, and then a projected increase. So really what I'd have wanted to do when Starmer got up again was to point that out. But he didn't. Which is, But, Johnson still didn't answer the question. He banged on about protecting jobs. Now, well, this is true. The furlough scheme and the government have done a decent amount. They haven't done enough. Even, according to some of their own think tanks, have not done enough, because there's a lot of people fell through the holes in the furlough scheme. I think at least 1 million people, in fact. But this was the weird things. Then he went on about schools, and he thought he had an opening here, and he really shouldn't have done, but maybe he did. And he said, well, the best way, he talks about the furlough scheme, and he says the best way to stop the widening of poverty is to get kids back into schools, because they are safe. It's safe to get kids back into schools. And he tried to say that Starmer kept changing his stance on this. This is going back to something last week, because he was trying to suggest that Starmer 1 week says that schools are not safe, and then the next week says we need to get kids into schools, drawing it as if it's a contradiction, when of course it's not. The position is that we want to get kids back into schools, but we want them to get back into safe schools. But Boris Johnson is now trying the angle, say that schools are safe, say that it isn't. So Keir stood up and then just said, look, it's quite clear that the Prime Minister hasn't got a clue about what his own report says. And he broached the subject of the Prime Minister trying to suggest that Keir Starmer was being inconsistent. And he says, well, the Prime Minister has now U-turned 3 times. He's the expert on changing positions. And, and he also quoted the government as saying that they stand to do whatever is necessary to help councils. And he says, has the government kept that promise? To which Boris Johnson stood up and he talked about his £63 million again. We talked about that last week, not being enough for anything. And then went on the attack again. And this... Since the return over the sort of May, half term for them, he has tried this. He's obviously, his preparation for PMQs now is just of the form of attack with this thing. And you'll notice all the way through, he attacks with the same thing, because he can only keep one thing in his head at a time. And they're saying, just attack him on this, attack him on this. No matter what he asks you, just bring it back to this. Because that's what he did. Keir Starmer didn't ask him any questions about schools, but Boris Johnson keeps going on about schools. At the same time, you do still have to counter that. And he said, Starmer won't answer the questions. I'm asking these questions about schools. He's not answering. But the point is that these questions are for the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister is not answering the fact that Tory councils, because Keir Starmer quoted a Tory council leader, for example, saying that the money from the government is not enough to cover anything. They're not getting the help they need. It's going to fall well short. The extra money the government have given is going to fall well short of what they're short of themselves from the loss of business rates. At which point, Keir Starmer then stood up for his 4th question and first of all noted, he says, because Boris Johnson's, banging on these questions at Starmer, and he's saying this seems to have turned into opposition's questions. And if the Prime Minister wants to swap places, then I'm quite happy to do that, and I will do so quite now. Obviously, that got a bit of a laugh as well. And again, he did note that the Prime Minister hadn't answered the question. Now, I've said before, I think he should just say that after everyone. Say it after everyone. A lot of people, when they're watching any debate, but particularly a debate of this nature, it's almost like if you don't challenge what someone has just said, you're accepting it, which is not true. You cannot just take for granted the fact that someone watching it will really see the answers and non-answers for what they are. every time Keir Starmer stands up, apart from the first time, he has to say, Prime Minister's not, you've not answered the question that I said. Reiterate it really quickly and then move on. And he did it on this occasion, but I think he should just do it every time. And again, he talked about a Conservative-led council of Lancashire County Council, talking about the financial hit they were going to take and that the government money is nowhere near enough to cover the deficit. And he says if the Prime Minister's own council leaders are talking about this, he must have known about this problem for months. Why was he so slow to act? At which case, Johnson was straight out of his seat. Oh, he was happy for this one. And he said, oh, we weren't slow. And he again quoted some figures about money provided for. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. This is a tricky one always to pin on a government, because the problem is, the point that Starmer is making is that whatever money the government is making available to councils isn't enough. That is the key thing. What the Prime Minister will then do, and any politician would do this is not a slight on Johnson, is they will quote the figures they're putting in, because they will always sound huge. One particular figure was something £1 billion. So it's huge. It's too huge for us. And he could have said 20 million. It would still have sounded huge, because we don't know the sums involved. So it just sounds like, oh, Starmer's saying that they're not putting money in. He's quoting that they are putting money in. So, who's telling the truth? It's like one of them must be lying. No, because what Johnson is saying is the money he's putting in. What Starmer's saying is not enough. And that's the fact of it. But that's very, very difficult to corner. That's the sort of thing you need pointing out in the media, really. But the point is that he didn't address the concerns of his own councils. He didn't address the point, and therefore the question, that Tory councils, because for all Boris Johnson, at one point he tried to say, oh, it's a shame Labour councils aren't getting on with this. This is Conservative councils that are saying this isn't good enough. And anyway, so again, it was another one that wasn't answered. Then Starmer, for his fifth one, said, look, the Prime Minister's just not taking this seriously. Because what Johnson kept trying to say, as if he thought he had an opening, is he kept coming back to the schools. Will the leader of the opposition ask about the school? Will he say schools are safe? Will he say schools are safe? He won't say schools are safe. Why not? But the question that Starmer was putting to him was about poverty. Was about council services, was about funding for councils. And he's saying, the Prime Minister's just not taking this seriously at all, which is absolutely true. Because, even if Boris Johnson wants to talk about a particular thing, I mean, he can talk about whatever he wants to at any time. Any time at all. The purpose of a Prime Minister's questions is to take questions, and it's a form of scrutiny in your own government. And if you are not willing to answer those questions, then you've got something to hide. And that needs pointing out as well. Starmer was saying that as a result of these funding problems, there are going to be local services that cannot reopen. It'll be all very well the government announcing that certain things can reopen with the easing of the lockdown. If there isn't the money for these local services, they will not reopen. Not because of the coronavirus pandemic or the lockdown restrictions, but because there is no money. And that, of course, will increase poverty. And he says, will the Prime Minister take responsibility and do something? Now, Johnson, of course, then got up, because again, this gives him his little lead in. He says, now he again outlined what the government are doing, and he says, oh, local government should be very proud of what has been done. And he came on to this point about Labour councils, or if only Labour councils would do more to open their schools, it'd all be fine. And he says, for the last time, because he knew it was coming up to Starmer's last question, for the last time, will he say it's safe to return? He was accusing Starmer of being silent on the issue because unions are forcing him to stop saying they're safe. Now, it was a vague question from Starmer, so the fact that Boris Johnson didn't really give an objective answer, you can't really blame him for. You wouldn't. Even a decent Prime Minister wouldn't if they didn't have to. But possibly the vague question was for political purposes as well, just to highlight the fact that Boris Johnson does not want to talk about the issues around poverty. Now, I have to say, with Boris Johnson banging on about as soon as it was clear that he wanted to bang on about schools, I think I would have nipped it in the bud. Because Starmer didn't engage with that at all. Now, the problem with that is, and it is true that this isn't for if the Prime Minister wants to ask the Leader of the Opposition questions, that's fine. He can organise a television debate. I don't think Keir Starmer would object to that if they just want to debate something else. The purpose of Prime Minister's questions is questions for the Prime Minister. That being said, on the schools front, I think what I might have said is to nip it in the bud, is just to stand up and to have said, look, if the Prime Minister wants to convince us that schools are safe for all children to return to, because that's what they're trying to say, it's at least what they're trying to imply, not just that they're safe for a small number of kids that they want return at the moment, that they're safe for kids to return. Now, if the government are trying to say that, that's fine. Release the minutes, the full unredacted minutes of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies meeting, where the government's own scientific advisors stated that schools are safe to be fully reopened. I'd have just stood up and said that. There is no comeback from that. Boris Johnson would then not have been able to keep pushing it. And I really wish he'd have just said that. But he didn't. He just ignored it. Rightly or wrongly, just because it's not what I would have done, I've said it before, is not necessarily that it was wrong. But I just feel, do not let Boris Johnson get any angle at all in this. You know, don't let him make it look like you're being evasive yourself. But anyway, Keir Starmer's actual sixth question, again, he reiterated the fact that if Boris Johnson doesn't like questions, then we can swap places. That's fine. Then he went on to the immigration health surcharge. Now, this was a thing some weeks ago. Keir Starmer forced another U-turn from Boris Johnson on the issue of the NHS surcharge. So migrant workers in the UK who already pay taxes and therefore pay their share for NHS services. They pay the same rates as the rest of us. They don't pay lower taxes or anything like that. Some pay higher, because if you're American, you have to pay taxes to the American government. It has always baffled me. A country that was effectively founded on the notion of taxation being fair. And then they charge their own citizens when they don't even live in America or work in America. But anyway, they pay British tax rates at the same rate as everyone else, of course, according to how much they earn. And but they also have to pay extra, quite a lot extra as well, for the so-called NHS surcharge, which is deeply immoral, just as a point of fact. But particularly at this time, it's particularly egregious when you are charging doctors, nurses, paramedics, or healthcare workers in general, who are risking their lives now, not just working hard to keep us alive, but risking their own lives to do so, particularly when they're not being given proper equipment. And they have to pay extra to access the healthcare that they provide for others. And so Boris Johnson, despite, because it was suggested to him that maybe he should look at this and change it, and he refused, and he stuck by his guns for a little while, and then it seemed that backbench Tory MPs were rebelling against this idea, so he was forced to U-turn. So he said they would not pay the surcharge. Well, Keir Starmer was noting that it's now a month later, and people are still being charged. That healthcare workers are still being charged, NHS workers are still being charged, and he said, well, the Prime Minister said he would act. When will he do so? To which Boris Johnson said he was grateful for an important question, and he says those who have paid the surcharge will be refunded. Now, here's the thing about that. There's two aspects to this. First of all, it doesn't answer the question. The question is, when is this going to come into force? He didn't answer that. That is worrying, because it's bad enough that it's been delayed as long as it has. Don't tell me it takes this long to implement that policy. But the fact that he couldn't give a clear answer as to, this should have been a question he could give a clear answer to. The fact that he couldn't, that is actually worrying, because it makes you wonder how much longer this is going to go on. And if they're going to just not implement it and wait till the heat's died down and then just never implement it. But the other aspect of this is, it's a typical rich man's response, isn't it? Oh yeah, you've been charged this thing. Yeah, we haven't got the system in place. Don't worry though, because you'll be refunded. The point is that quite a lot of NHS workers are not paid properly. And this surcharge amounts to, for some, thousands of pounds. They can't afford to be without that money. It's no good telling them, it's all right, you'll be refunded at some point in the future, for which you'll inevitably have to apply. They can't they're doing without by having that money go out their accounts right now. They're already having to do without. But typical rich man's answer, isn't it? Because they're just thinking to themselves, well, it just comes out of your savings, doesn't it? We'll give it you back, don't worry. Not everyone has savings. But like I say, it doesn't answer the question, and that is worrying. Then into other questions. I'll go on to the SNP's one. There are a few other ones of note, but I'll just go on to the SNP's ones for now. So Ian Blackford, the leader of the SNP, the second largest opposition party in Westminster, and he highlighted with both of his questions, he did this last week as well, I think it's if you're only going to have two questions, I do think it's better to stick to one theme. And he went on to the theme of, again, children in poverty. And he noted that Marcus Rashford, the footballer who was very instrumental in the campaign that allowed MPs to force a government U-turn. He said he's shown more moral leadership in the last few days than the Tory government have in the past decade. And he quoted some research showing, people in poverty and 60% being forced to borrow and 70% being forced to do without some essentials. And I can speak to that because I, in the past have been out of work. And the thing I had to do without to make ends meet was gas. I couldn't afford gas, so no hot water, no heating, anything like that. You have to do without something. And so Ian Blackford asked about increases in social support funds. An increase in this would just help so many families. And he said, would the Prime Minister uplift the child element of tax credits, the benefits, by £20 a week? Universal credit is actually the term that's used in a lot of places now. But would he basically increase those benefits by £20 per week per child? Now, the Prime Minister at this point was less combative with this sort of question. He says the government has done everything that it can. And he says, we are aware that there will be tough times ahead. That's his usual Tory things. Tough times ahead. We've all got to make sacrifices. And he says that they stand by to do more where they can. Now, here is the thing. I will always say this. This is my stock response to this. Any government that can waste money, know it's wasting money. I don't mean to spend money on something that then just doesn't pan out. I mean actively, knowingly waste money, not on a service. That means giving contracts to Tory donors where a lot of that money is not going to be effectively spent. Vanity projects, things we don't need right now. We don't need a royal yacht, like another one. We don't need one. I'm not denying the fact that these things aren't needed at some point. Part of diplomacy. We don't need a new one and we don't need one right now. And the only reason they're doing it is for some flag waving exercise. So whenever a government can afford to waste money like that on something that gives no benefits to the people paying those taxes, you do not get to say that we ain't got enough money. Because it's like an individual person. If you're buying things you don't need, luxuries, you don't get to say you can't afford the essentials. Cut back on your luxuries first if money's tight. And a country should do the same. You cut back on your luxuries. If he's not going to cut back on the luxuries, you don't get to say we ain't got enough for the essentials. But the point is that he didn't answer the question. It was a yes or no question. Will you increase by £20? He could have said yes, or he could have said no, but the reasoning is this. And he didn't say either. Then Blackford's next question, which was on the same theme, he says, £20 a week is what we're asking. And this is actually quite a good way of phrasing it as well, because just like the government will, when it's talking about the amount of money it's throwing across the whole of England, for example, this £63 million, sounds like a big figure. Sounds a lot. It's not. You spread it across all the councils. It's pathetic. It amounts to less than in England you've got a population of about 55 million, correct me if I'm wrong about that. So it's just over £1 a person. What? So it's not a lot, is it? But it sounds a lot, because to a person 63 million is a lot. Just like the £20 a week. Obviously we're asking for more than £20 a week from the government, because that's times all the children in poverty at the moment. But again, by calling it £20 a week, you make it sound like a small figure. Why can't you just afford this? So, good politics there. And he says £20 a week is what they're asking for to stop families having to choose between paying the bills and feeding children, because that's the reality for a lot. And And he says, Tory austerity has scrapped child poverty targets, because that's true as well. They've the Conservatives over the last 10 years were left a legacy by the previous Labour government of targets to meet for various things. They just one by one had to scrap them because they could not meet them. They were just getting worse and worse. And and he says the Prime Minister is too interested in vanity projects, including the latest one is he wants the government jet repainting for £100,000. Now, £100,000. I mean, if he wants it repainting, that's fine. Again, under normal circumstances, but is it necessary? No, it's not up for repainting anyway. He just doesn't like the colour. That's it. That's honestly it. That's his reasoning, and it's a luxury. Do I begrudge a government ordinarily doing something like that? No. But you don't get to do that and plead poverty for essentials. So what Ian Blackford asked for his question, I thought it was a very good question to finish on, is saying, is the Prime Minister really saying that he cannot find £20 a week for these families? Now, here's the thing. The reason why I like that question is because if the Prime Minister doesn't answer it, then he hasn't said no. And the Prime Minister said he's not saying that. And he says that's why they're increasing funds and using innovative ways to protect jobs. He said, in terms of the wage retention scheme, the furlough scheme, he says no other country has a wage retention scheme like the UK has. This is not actually true. Lots of European countries have a better one than us. I'm not criticising the one that was adopted in this country. I think for a Conservative government, it was astounding. It's fine. It's okay. There are countries in Europe that have got a better system. Take Switzerland, for example, because they're quite comparable because they also guarantee 80% of wages, but that's for 2 years. Ours was for a few months. It's ending quite soon. It's been phased out because it's not going to be 80% very soon. It's going to be 60%, and then it's going to be phased out for the next few years. That's not better than Switzerland's. That's far worse. That's demonstrably worse. And it's not as good as in some other of the major countries of Europe either. So that was just straight up not true. But he knows no one's going to come back to him on that one. But here's the thing. If the Prime Minister says that he's not saying they can't find the £20 a week, but he's also saying he'll do everything he can, does that mean he is going to find the £20 a week? He's not saying they can't find the money. And he said they'll do what they can. So if you're saying the money might be there, then you need to find out. But there it is. That was Prime Minister's questions for today. It was an interesting one. It was actually very interesting because Boris Johnson is being buoyed by these attacks. I will just say as my final point, I do feel that Starmer needs to he needs to engage with Boris Johnson. The two reasons. First of all, does it look like Boris Johnson is doing well in Prime Minister's questions? No, because he's not answering the questions. To anyone who's even trying to pay attention, it's obvious he's not answering the questions. We don't look good. Here's the thing, though. But Boris Johnson feels that he's winning just because he's, like with the schools thing today, he thought he had Starmer. He genuinely did. Now, I don't know what the right-wing press are going to write about this. I never know that until later. If anything interesting happens, I might do a follow-up video. I sometimes do that tomorrow. But Boris Johnson feels that he's able to come out with something. And if what is actually happening is his advisors are saying, look, ignore his questions, this is the thing we think you can get Starmer on, just keep coming back at it. And if he doesn't answer it and he won't answer it, then keep saying that. Every time you stand up, just keep saying, oh, I notice he's not answering this question, because that's exactly what he did. And I reckon he was coached for that. That's given him confidence. We want a Prime Minister, if he won't answer the questions, if he'll answer the questions, fine, I'll lay off him. But if he won't answer the questions, you need to have him scared to get up to the dispatch box. Because that's what he was like in the first few weeks of Starmer. Now he thinks he's got a handle on him. It's not true, but he thinks he has. It's given him confidence. What we don't want is him having confidence, because he's not used to being without confidence. Confidence is bred into him. Deprive him of it and he falls to pieces. Deprive him of it. Like I said on the schools, I already said what I would say on the subject, and I do think he needs to do that. The questions he's asking are perfectly good questions. It makes it obvious when he's not, because he's not asking stupid questions like, do you agree with this or do you disagree with this? To which the Prime Minister can just stand up and be contrary. And it looks like he's answered the question, which he will have done. He's asking questions where it's very obvious whether or not you've answered it. But I do think he could do more. But that's my reading of it anyway. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further. Please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.